I remember the exact moment everything changed. Not because it was dramatic or obvious, but because it was so quiet I almost missed it. The kind of moment that rewrites your entire understanding of someone in the space of a single breath. We were on my couch that night, Carter and I, the way we'd been 100 times before. The apartment was dim except for the blue glow from the television screen. Some thriller we'd picked without much thought playing forgotten in the background. My place always felt smaller when he was there. Not because he took up too much space, but because his presence seemed to fill every corner, leaving no room for the careful distance I usually kept between my feelings and the rest of the world. Carter had stretched out, legs tangled with mine in that careless way friends do, his head tilted back against the cushions. I was pretending to watch the movie, but really I was watching him. The way shadows moved across his face in the flickering light. The way his breathing had settled into something slower, more relaxed than it ever was during the day when he was performing confidence for everyone else. He'd been different lately. Softer around the edges, like some invisible armor he usually wore had started to crack. I noticed it in small things. The way he'd started staying later after our movie nights, finding excuses to linger by my door. How his usual easy banter had been interrupted by these pockets of silence that felt heavy with something neither of us was naming. That night, something shifted in the air between us. Maybe it was the wine we'd shared, or the late hour, or just the accumulated weight of 2 years of friendship that had always felt like it was balanced on the edge of something deeper. Carter turned toward me, and suddenly the space on the couch felt impossibly small. His face was closer than it had ever been. Close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough to count the freckles scattered across his cheekbones like stars. His smile was different too, unguarded in a way that made my chest tight. It wasn't the practiced grin he gave everyone else, the one that charmed professors and made other students gravitate toward him without knowing why. This was something raw and uncertain and entirely meant for me. I felt my breath catch. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into something elastic and strange. I was acutely aware of everything. The sound of rain starting against my windows. The smell of his cologne mixed with something warmer, more familiar. The way his eyes dropped briefly to my mouth before finding mine again. The distance between us shrank by degrees. Neither of us moved decisively, but somehow we were leaning into each other like magnets, drawn by some invisible force I've been fighting against for longer than I cared to admit. My heart was hammering so hard I was certain he could hear it, but I couldn't make myself pull away. Then he whispered it. 3 words that should have stopped everything. We shouldn't do this. His voice was rough, barely audible, but each word landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the charged air between us. I felt them settle into my chest, heavy with meaning I was afraid to interpret. But here's the thing that broke me, that made everything that came after inevitable. He didn't move away. His eyes never left mine. His hand, which had somehow found its way to rest against my shoulder, didn't retreat. If anything, he leaned closer, closing the last few inches between us until I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. My mind went completely blank. All those months of careful friendship, of swallowing feelings and pretending not to notice the way he looked at me sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention, of convincing myself that the electricity I felt when we touched was entirely one-sided. All of it crumbled in the face of his contradiction between his words and his actions. I should have listened to what he said, should have pulled back, made some joke to break the tension, restored the safe distance we'd maintained for 2 years. But I couldn't. I was caught between obeying the warning in his words and answering the pull in his eyes, frozen in the space where desire and denial collided. The silence stretched between us, fragile as spun glass. I could hear everything in that quiet. The subtle intake of his breath, the soft rhythm of rain against glass, the electric hum of tension that seemed to fill every molecule of air in the room. My apartment, usually cluttered with the chaos of my photography, negatives draped over chairs, contact sheets scattered across tables, cameras in various states of repair, felt like it was holding its breath along with us. Carter's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against my shoulder, and I realized he was trembling. This boy who moved through the world with such easy confidence, who could charm his way into or out of anything, who seemed to have every aspect of his life mapped out with the same precision he brought to his sports medicine studies. He was shaking. I wanted to say something to break the spell or acknowledge what was happening between us, but words felt impossible. How do you name something that exists only in the space between intention and action, in the pause before a decision that could change everything? His eyes searched mine, and I saw something in them I'd never allowed myself to recognize before. Not just desire, though that was there, electric and undeniable, but something deeper, a longing that matched my own, a recognition that we'd been dancing around this moment for longer than either of us had been willing to admit. I thought about all the times I'd caught him staring at me across lecture halls, the way conversations between us sometimes trailed off into loaded silences, how he'd started finding excuses to touch me in small ways. A hand on my back, fingers brushing mine when he handed me something, the way he'd sit just a little too close when we studied together. The realization hit me like a physical force. This wasn't just my secret anymore. Whatever I'd been carrying alone, Carter had been carrying it too. The knowledge was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. In that stretched moment, with his face inches from mine and his whispered warning still hanging in the air between us, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened next would fundamentally change us. There would be no going back to the easy friendship we'd built, no pretending we hadn't crossed some invisible line that neither of us had been brave enough to acknowledge before. The weight of that knowledge should have terrified me, should have sent me scrambling for safer ground. But all I could think about was the way he was looking at me, like I was something precious and dangerous at the same time, like he was memorizing my face in case this moment disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. We stayed there, suspended in possibility, neither of us willing to be the one to break the spell or take the final step that would make this real. And in that endless pause, I understood that some lines, once approached, become impossible to ignore, no matter how many words of warning are whispered in the dark. I suppose I should tell you who we were before that night changed everything. Who I was, who Carter was, and how we'd managed to build something so careful and complete that it took one whispered warning to make us both realize we'd been lying to ourselves all along. My name is Jonah, and at 22, I was the kind of person who observed life more than I lived it. My apartment reflected that tendency, a cramped studio near campus that had become more archive than home. Every surface was claimed by my photography. Contact sheets spread across my kitchen table like tarot cards revealing fragments of moments I'd captured. Strips of negatives hung from a makeshift clothesline I'd strung between two windows, creating a curtain of suspended memories that caught the light and threw shadows across my walls. Polaroids were taped everywhere, dozens of them creating a mosaic of faces and places and fleeting expressions I'd felt compelled to preserve. My professors called it promising work, but I knew better. I wasn't capturing beauty or truth or any of those lofty things photographers are supposed to chase. I was collecting evidence, proof that moments happened, that feelings existed, that the space between people could be measured in something more tangible than aching. I'd always been like that, even before I picked up a camera. The kind of person who noticed things others missed. The way someone's smile changed when they thought no one was looking. How certain combinations of light and shadow could make ordinary rooms feel sacred. The precise moment when laughter turned into something more honest and harder to hold. It made me good at photography, but it also made me careful with my own feelings. When you spend that much time studying how vulnerable people become when they think they're unobserved, you learn to guard yourself. To keep your own unguarded moments locked away where no one can accidentally capture them and pin them to a wall for examination. Carter was the opposite of careful. He was 23, a year ahead of me, studying sports medicine with the kind of focused intensity that made professors remember his name and classmates orbit around him without quite knowing why. But that intensity wasn't born from anxiety the way mine was. Carter moved through the world like he belonged in it, like every room he entered had been waiting specifically for his arrival. He was magnetic in a way that seemed effortless, but probably wasn't. Tall enough to command attention, broad-shouldered from years of playing soccer before a knee injury redirected his relationship with sports from participation to healing. His dark hair was always slightly messed, like he'd run his fingers through it while thinking, and his brown eyes held flecks of gold that caught light in ways that made me want to photograph him constantly. Not that I ever did, at least not obviously. I'd learned early in our friendship that Carter was uncomfortable being the subject of focused attention, despite how naturally he drew it. He preferred to deflect, to turn conversations toward other people, to make everyone around him feel like the most interesting person in the room while revealing almost nothing about himself. We'd met during sophomore year in a philosophy class neither of us had particularly wanted to take. I'd been sitting in the back row, as usual, when he'd slid into the seat beside me and whispered that the professor looked like someone who'd never had an impure thought in his entire life. The observation was so unexpected and perfectly accurate that I'd laughed out loud, earning a sharp look from said professor and sealing some invisible pact between us. After class, he'd asked if I wanted to get coffee, then dinner. Then he'd ended up on my couch, looking through my photographs while I tried not to watch him too closely. He'd lingered over certain images, a study of hands I'd shot in the library, shadows falling across a stairwell, the profile of a girl reading by a window, with the kind of attention that told me he understood something about seeing that most people missed. From that night forward, we'd been inseparable in the way that only happens in college, when friendship can consume entire days and reshape your understanding of yourself. We fell into patterns that felt as natural as breathing. Carter would appear at my door most evenings around 7, usually carrying takeout or groceries for something we could cook together. We'd eat while discussing everything: his classes, my photography, books we were reading, dreams we barely dared voice out loud. He had opinions about everything, but held them lightly, ready to be convinced or delighted by different perspectives. He was curious about my work in a way that made me want to be better at it, asking questions that pushed me to articulate things I'd only felt intuitively. Why that angle instead of another? What were you trying to capture that you couldn't just say with words? After dinner, we'd usually end up on my couch, a movie playing while we talked, or fell into comfortable silence. He'd stretch out, claiming more space than he needed, but somehow we'd always end up tangled together, legs overlapping, his head on my shoulder, my fingers sometimes finding their way into his hair without either of us acknowledging it. Those were the moments when I'd catch glimpses of who Carter really was beneath all that easy confidence. When his guard would drop, and I'd see something more fragile, more uncertain. Sometimes he'd talk about the pressure he felt to have everything figured out, how everyone expected him to excel at whatever came next just because he'd made it look easy so far. Other times he'd go quiet, staring at the ceiling with an expression I couldn't quite read, but desperately wanted to photograph. I told myself our closeness was normal, that all friendships had moments of intensity, of connection that felt almost electric, that the way my heart sped up when he smiled at me was just a natural response to being seen and appreciated by someone whose opinion mattered, that the careful way I watched him when he wasn't looking was simple aesthetic appreciation. He was beautiful, after all, in that unconscious way that some people are. But even then, if I'm being honest, I knew I was lying to myself. I knew that what I felt for Carter had crossed the line from friendship into something more dangerous and impossible to take back. I just didn't know he'd been standing on the same line, looking across the same divide, afraid to name what he saw there. That night on the couch, when the distance between us collapsed, and he whispered we shouldn't do this while refusing to pull away, that was when I finally understood that some feelings are too big to hide, no matter how carefully you've trained yourself to keep them in the shadows. The morning after, we both pretended it never happened. Carter texted me around noon with a link to some article about the film we'd barely watched, as if we'd spent the entire evening discussing cinematography instead of suspended in that charged moment that had rewritten everything between us. His message was casual, punctuated with the same easy humor he'd always used, but I read it 17 times looking for some hidden acknowledgement of what had passed between us in the dark. I responded with equal casualness, matching his tone like we were actors who'd rehearsed this scene of careful normalcy. But my hands shook as I typed, and I found myself staring at my phone for minutes after sending each message, waiting for something. An admission, a question, anything that might crack the facade we were both suddenly working so hard to maintain. When he showed up at my door 3 nights later, Chinese takeout in hand and that familiar grin stretching across his face, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it all. The whispered warning, the way he'd leaned closer instead of pulling away, the weight of possibility that had filled the space between us. Maybe it had been the wine, or the late hour, or simply my own desperate, wishful thinking projected onto innocent proximity. But then I noticed the small things. The way he hesitated for just a fraction of a second before settling onto the couch, as if measuring the distance between us more carefully than he ever had before. How his laugh came a beat too quickly when I made jokes, like he was overcompensating for something. The way his eyes would find mine and then dart away, as if he'd been caught at something he couldn't name. We fell back into our routines, but they felt different now. Fragile. Like we were walking through a familiar room in the dark, trying not to disturb anything while knowing we'd already knocked something precious off a shelf, and were just waiting for the sound of it hitting the floor. The fourth night he came over, we were watching some action movie neither of us particularly cared about when he stretched out beside me, longer and more deliberate than usual. His arm brushed against mine as he settled, and instead of the unconscious tangle we'd always fallen into, there was something almost ceremonial about the way he positioned himself. Close enough to touch, but with space between us that felt intentional and loaded. Halfway through the movie, his hand dropped to rest against my knee. Not holding, not caressing, just there. Present and warm and impossible to ignore. I felt every nerve in my body focus on that single point of contact, the way you become hyper-aware of a cut on your finger. Not painful, but impossible to forget. I didn't move, didn't acknowledge it, but I stopped breathing normally, and I knew he could tell because his own breathing had changed too, becoming more careful and controlled. We sat like that for 20 minutes, watching explosions on screen, while the real tension built between us in increments too small to address, but too significant to ignore. When the credits rolled, I expected him to leave the way he always did, with some joke about having to get up early, or an assignment he needed to finish. Instead, he turned toward me, and I saw something in his expression that made my chest tight. He looked like he was gathering courage for something, like he was standing at the edge of a cliff trying to decide whether to jump. I walked him to the door, the way I always did, but we moved slower than usual, like neither of us wanted the evening to end. He paused with his hand on the doorknob, and for a moment I thought he might turn around and say something that would acknowledge what was happening between us. Instead, he looked back over his shoulder and said, almost casually, "You ever think about how things would be different if we let them?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I felt it settle into my chest, heavy with implications I was afraid to examine too closely. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I was caught between honesty and safety, between the desperate desire to say yes. I think about it constantly, and the terrifying knowledge that admitting it would change everything irreversibly. He must have seen something in my expression, because his face shifted and he waved his hand dismissively. "Forget it," he said with a laugh that sounded forced. "Too much wine last weekend, I guess." Still processing whatever that was. But the way he said it told me he wasn't processing it at all. He was cataloging it, the same way I'd been doing. Storing it away and taking it out to examine when he was alone, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere but refused to be discarded. After he left, I stood in my empty apartment surrounded by all my photographs, these captured moments of other people's unguarded expressions, and realized I'd never felt more exposed in my life. For 2 years, I believed my feelings for Carter were my secret to carry alone. But that question, "You ever think about how things would be different?" made it clear that whatever I'd been hiding, he'd been hiding something too. The thought was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. If Carter was fighting the same pull I'd been resisting, if he was lying awake thinking about the space between us the way I was, then we were both complicit in this careful dance we'd been performing. Both guilty of pretending normalcy while electricity built between us. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about his hand on my knee, The way he'd position himself on the couch like he was testing boundaries neither of us had agreed to set. The casual way he'd asked a question that contained multitudes, then dismissed it before I could find the courage to answer honestly. Over the following days, I found myself watching him differently when he came over, looking for signs that he was fighting the same internal war I was, searching for cracks in the performance we were both putting on. And I found them. In the way he'd catch himself staring at me and quickly look away. How he'd started finding excuses to touch me in small ways. Passing me something and letting his fingers linger against mine, brushing imaginary lint off my shoulder, standing just close enough while we cooked that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. Each tiny transgression felt enormous, like we were building towards something inevitable that neither of us was brave enough to acknowledge. We were still friends, still ourselves, but underneath the familiar rhythms of our relationship, something was shifting, growing, demanding attention we were both too scared to give it. The facade was cracking, and we both knew it. The facade couldn't hold forever. What started as hairline cracks became fissures, and what began as careful pretense transformed into something that felt like slowly drowning in plain sight. Our friendship began to bend under the weight of everything we weren't saying. We were still ourselves, still the same two people who'd spent countless evenings talking until dawn, still comfortable enough to exist in each other's spaces without explanation. But every interaction now carried an undercurrent that made the familiar feel foreign and charged. I started waiting for him in ways that felt dangerous. Not just the usual anticipation of seeing a friend, but something more acute and consuming. I find myself listening for his footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, my entire body attuned to the rhythm of his approach. When he knocked, I'd wait a few seconds before answering, trying to compose myself into some semblance of normalcy, as if I hadn't been counting the minutes since his last text. My apartment, cluttered as it was with the detritus of my photography, began to feel too quiet without him there. The negatives hanging from their improvised clothesline seemed like ghosts of moments I'd captured but couldn't inhabit, and the Polaroids taped to my walls felt like evidence of a life I was observing rather than living. Only when Carter filled the space did everything feel real and immediate and worth the careful attention I usually reserve for subjects behind my lens. He was changing too, in ways that were subtle but impossible for me to miss. The easy confidence that had always been his default seemed to require more effort now, like he was consciously performing a version of himself that used to come naturally. His smiles lingered a fraction too long, his laughter came a beat too quickly, and his casual touches, a hand on my shoulder, fingers brushing mine when he passed me something, felt deliberately casual in a way that made them anything but. I began to notice how his gaze would settle on me when he thought I was distracted. If I was reviewing contact sheets at my kitchen table, or standing at the stove, stirring something for dinner, or adjusting the hang of a photograph on my wall, I could feel the weight of his attention like a physical presence. When I'd look up, expecting to catch him staring, he'd already be looking elsewhere, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that told me I hadn't imagined it. The night everything shifted happened 3 weeks after his question about things being different. We'd fallen into our usual routine. Takeout containers scattered across my coffee table, some documentary playing on my laptop that we were both ignoring in favor of conversation. But the conversation felt different too, more careful and more loaded, like we were both afraid of saying something that would finally shatter the delicate balance we'd been maintaining. Carter had stretched out on the couch beside me, claiming space the way he always did, but there was something more intentional about it this time. He positioned himself so that we were facing each other, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that every breath felt shared. We talked about nothing important, his classes, my latest photography assignment, plans for the weekend that we both knew would probably involve more evenings exactly like this one. But underneath the mundane topics, there was a current of something else, something that made every pause feel pregnant with possibility. And then, without warning or ceremony, Carter fell asleep. It happened gradually, the way sleep sometimes creeps up during comfortable conversations. His responses grew slower. His eyes stayed closed a fraction longer each time he blinked, and eventually his breathing settled into the deeper rhythm of unconsciousness. His head had been resting against the back of the couch, but as sleep took hold, it tilted sideways until it came to rest against my shoulder. I froze, not because I was uncomfortable. I've been in similar positions with Carter dozens of times before, but because something about this moment felt different, more deliberate, despite his unconsciousness, more significant than all our previous casual intimacies combined. The weight of his head against my shoulder was warm and solid and impossibly precious. I could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, could smell the faint scent of his shampoo mixed with something more essentially him. His face, relaxed in sleep, looked younger and more vulnerable than it ever did when he was awake and performing confidence for the world. I sat perfectly still for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, afraid that any movement might wake him and break whatever spell had settled over us. The documentary continued playing, but I wasn't watching it. I was memorizing the exact weight of Carter's head against my shoulder, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the barely audible sound he made when he exhaled. This was dangerous territory, I knew that. Sitting there in the blue glow from my laptop screen, cataloging the details of Carter's sleeping face with the same intensity one brought to composing photographs. I was crossing lines I'd drawn for myself years ago. But I couldn't bring myself to care about safety or appropriate boundaries or any of the careful rules I'd established to protect myself from exactly this kind of vulnerability. Time stretched and contracted strangely. I became hyper-aware of my own breathing, afraid that even that might disturb him. My left arm, trapped between his weight and the couch cushions, began to tingle from lack of circulation, but I didn't dare adjust my position. This moment felt too rare, too fragile, too much like something I'd been unconsciously waiting for without knowing it. When Carter finally stirred, shifting slightly but not lifting his head, he murmured something so quietly I almost missed it. "You're good at this," he said, the words slurred with sleep but unmistakably directed at me. My heart hammered against my ribs. "At what?" I whispered back, not trusting my normal voice not to crack. There was a pause so long I thought he'd fallen back asleep. Then, barely audible, "Staying still when everything's moving." The words settled into my chest like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything I thought I understood about us, about him, about the careful distance we'd been maintaining. Because staying still while everything moved, that was exactly what I'd been doing. Not just in that moment with his head on my shoulder, but for months, years, maybe. Holding myself perfectly motionless while my feelings for him shifted and grew and rearranged themselves into something I could no longer pretend was simple friendship. But the way he said it, with that drowsy honesty that comes just before sleep claims you completely, made me wonder if he'd been doing the same thing. If we'd both been sitting perfectly still while the ground shifted beneath us, afraid that any movement might send us tumbling into territory we weren't ready to navigate. He didn't wake up fully that night, just settled back into deeper sleep while I sat motionless beneath his weight, processing what felt like the most honest thing either of us had said to each other in weeks. And I didn't sleep at all. I spent the hours until dawn thinking about movement and stillness, about what happens when you've been holding your breath for so long that breathing normally feels like a revolution. The revelation came on a Tuesday night, 3 days after the evening when Carter had fallen asleep against my shoulder and whispered those words that had been echoing in my head ever since. We were walking back from dinner at that Italian place near campus, the one with red checkered tablecloths and wine that was terrible but cheap enough for college students to pretend sophistication. It had been one of our better evenings in weeks, free from the careful tension that had been threading through all our interactions lately. Carter had been more like himself, quick with jokes, animated when discussing his anatomy professor's latest impossible exam, genuinely interested when I told him about a photography series I was considering for my senior portfolio. For 2 hours, we'd managed to find our way back to the easy rhythm we'd perfected over 2 years of friendship. But as we walked through the quiet streets toward my apartment, the familiar weight of everything unspoken began to settle between us again. Our footsteps echoed against the pavement, and I found myself hyper-aware of the space between us. Close enough that our arms occasionally brushed, far enough that it felt intentional and loaded with significance I couldn't name. We stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, even though no cars were visible in either direction. The silence that had felt comfortable during dinner now stretched tight between us, and I could feel Carter's restlessness in the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. The words came out before I could stop them, drawn from the sleepless hours I'd spent turning his drowsy observation over in my mind. "That night when you leaned in," I said, my voice quieter than I'd intended. "Why didn't you stop?" Carter went very still beside me. I could see his jaw tighten in the orange glow from the streetlight, could feel him building walls in real time. For a moment, I thought he might deflect the way he always did, make some joke that would let us both pretend I hadn't asked the question that had been burning between us for weeks. Instead, he looked away, staring down the empty street as if something fascinating was approaching from the distance. "Because I didn't want to," he said finally, the words coming out rough and barely audible. The simple honesty of it hit me like a physical force. After weeks of careful performances and loaded silences and questions dismissed with nervous laughter, here was something real and unguarded and impossible to misinterpret. The truth we'd both been dancing around, finally spoken aloud in the yellow circle of light beneath a street lamp on an empty college street. The crosswalk signal changed, the electronic voice announcing that it was safe to proceed, but neither of us moved. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, the same way I'd felt that night on my couch when the distance between us had collapsed and he'd whispered his warning while refusing to pull away. My voice shook when I finally managed to speak again. "Then why did you say we shouldn't?" This time, Carter did look at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my chest tight with recognition. It was the same expression I'd been catching glimpses of for weeks. Vulnerability disguised as casualness, longing dressed up as friendship, fear wearing the mask of easy confidence. His eyes were dark when he answered, and I heard years of careful control in his voice. "Because if I said yes, I don't know if I could stop." The words settled into the space between us like smoke, heavy with implications that rewrote everything I thought I understood about our friendship, about him, about the careful boundaries we'd been pretending to maintain. This wasn't just about that single moment on my couch, I realized. This was about every loaded silence, every touch that had lingered too long, every question he'd asked and then dismissed before I could answer honestly. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, not literally, but in some fundamental way that made everything else seem suddenly unstable. For 2 years, I'd been carrying my feelings for Carter like a secret weight, convinced that what I felt was one-sided and dangerous and destined to remain unspoken. I'd built entire internal architectures around the assumption that he could never feel the same way, that our friendship was precious precisely because it was safe, bounded by his straightness and my own careful restraint. But standing there under the streetlight, looking into his face and seeing my own longing reflected back at me, I understood that I'd been wrong about almost everything. Carter's fear wasn't about rejection or disgust or any of the other nightmares I'd been carrying. His fear was about the same thing mine was, about wanting something so badly that admitting it felt like stepping off the edge of the world. "Because if I said yes, I don't know if I could stop." The words kept echoing in my head, and I began to understand all the layers of meaning they contained. This wasn't about physical restraint or crossing lines we'd drawn in the sand. This was about emotional surrender, about allowing himself to want something he'd been taught he wasn't supposed to want, about the terrifying possibility that letting himself feel this might change everything about who he thought he was. I've been so focused on protecting myself from the pain of unrequited feelings that I'd never considered the possibility that Carter might be fighting the same battle from the other side. That his easy confidence might be a performance, that his casual touches might be small acts of courage, that every time he deflected my attempts to get closer he'd been protecting himself as much as me. The crosswalk signal cycled through its pattern again, walk, don't walk, walk again, but we remained motionless, caught in the gravity of what had just been acknowledged between us. I wanted to say something, to respond to his admission with one of my own, to bridge the last few inches of distance that separated honesty from action. But words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what was happening. Instead, I found myself studying his face in the artificial light, memorizing the exact expression he wore when he'd finally told me the truth. He looked exhausted and relieved and terrified all at once, like someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden for so long that setting it down felt almost as painful as continuing to bear its weight. A car finally appeared in the distance, headlights sweeping across the intersection and reminding us that we were standing in the middle of an empty street, having a conversation that was reshaping both our lives. But even as we finally crossed, even as we continued walking toward my apartment in silence that felt completely different from any silence we'd shared before, I knew that something irreversible had just occurred. Carter's fear wasn't about me, or about what I might think, or about preserving our friendship. His fear was about himself, about wanting something he'd never allowed himself to want, about the possibility that saying yes to me might mean saying yes to parts of himself he'd been keeping carefully locked away. And for the first time since I'd started falling for him, I understood that I wasn't alone in this. That whatever happened next, we'd be figuring it out together. The days following our conversation at the crosswalk felt like living inside a hell breath. We'd crossed some invisible threshold with our admissions, but neither of us seemed to know what came next. The truth hung between us now, acknowledged but not acted upon, real but not resolved. Carter still came over, but everything felt different. Where our interactions had once carried an undercurrent of unspoken tension, now they thrummed with the weight of things we'd finally said aloud. He moved through my apartment like he was navigating around something fragile, careful not to disturb the new equilibrium we were both still learning to balance. I found myself watching him with an intensity that would have embarrassed me before, but which now felt like my right. When he sat on my couch, I studied the way he positioned himself, still close enough to touch, but with a deliberateness that acknowledged the electricity between us rather than pretending it didn't exist. When he helped me cook dinner, I noticed how he'd pause sometimes, caught between reaching for something and pulling back, as if his body was having arguments with itself that his mind couldn't quite resolve. We talked around the edges of what we'd admitted, never directly addressing it, but never able to forget it either. Our conversations had taken on a strange quality, like we were speaking in code that we both understood, but weren't quite ready to decode fully. Every pause felt loaded with potential. Every glance carried weight we were both still learning to bear. It was during one of these careful evenings, 2 weeks after the crosswalk confession, that the tension finally became unbearable. We were sitting on opposite ends of my couch, ostensibly watching a documentary about street photography that I'd put on because I thought it might provide safe common ground. But neither of us was really watching. I was hyper-aware of every shift in Carter's position, every time he looked in my direction, every moment when the space between us felt both too vast and impossibly small. The documentary droned on about composition and light, while I fought an internal war between patience and desperation. I'd been patient for 2 years, careful with my feelings and respectful of boundaries that had turned out to be mutual constructions rather than Carter's alone. But now, with the truth finally in the open, patience felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I turned to face him fully, drawing my legs up onto the couch in a way that closed some of the physical distance between us. Carter's eyes met mine, and I saw my own frustration reflected there, along with something that looked like relief that I'd been the one to break first. "I can't keep pretending we're not already crossing lines," I said, the words coming out steadier than I'd expected. "Every time you touch me, every time you look at me like you're memorizing my face, every time you fall asleep against my shoulder and tell me I'm good at staying still, we're already doing this, Carter. We're just not admitting it." The silence that followed was different from our usual loaded pauses. This one felt like the moment before lightning strikes, charged with the inevitability of what was coming. Carter's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, recognition, something that looked like grief. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion I couldn't quite name. "If we do this, I can't take it back." The words should have been a warning, but they sounded more like a plea, like he was asking me to give him permission to want something he'd been denying himself, or asking me to make the choice so he wouldn't have to bear the responsibility alone. I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. "Neither can I whispered back. And there it was. The acknowledgement that we'd already passed the point of no return, that whatever we chose now would fundamentally alter both of our lives. We weren't innocent friends anymore, if we ever had been. We were two people who'd admitted to wanting each other, who'd been circling around that want for weeks, who'd been pretending that desire could be contained by good intentions and careful boundaries. The documentary continued playing, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. Everything in my field of vision had narrowed to Carter's face, to the way he was looking at me, like I was something precious and dangerous simultaneously. I could see the exact moment when his resistance finally crumbled, when whatever internal arguments he'd been having resolved themselves into something like acceptance. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility and fear and the strange relief that comes when you finally stop fighting something that's stronger than your ability to resist it. I watched Carter's chest rise and fall with carefully controlled breathing, saw his hands clench and unclench against his thighs like he was physically restraining himself from reaching for me. I thought about all the nights we'd spent on this couch, all the careful inches we'd maintained between our bodies, all the conversations we'd had that circled around this moment without ever acknowledging its inevitability. I thought about the way he'd whispered we shouldn't do this while leaning closer instead of pulling away, the question he'd asked about things being different if we let them, the admission that he didn't want to stop. None of it had been casual. None of it had been innocent. We'd been building toward this moment for months, maybe years, constructing a foundation of trust and intimacy and unspoken understanding that could support the weight of what we were about to acknowledge. Carter shifted on the couch, angling his body toward mine in a way that eliminated the last pretense of distance between us. The movement was small but seismic, a surrender disguised as adjustment. His eyes never left mine, and I saw something in them I'd been waiting to see without knowing it. Not just desire, but decision. "I'm scared," he said quietly, and the honesty of it made something in my chest crack open. "So am I admit it, but fear felt like a small price to pay for the possibility of having something real with him, something that acknowledged the truth of what we'd been feeling instead of dancing around it. We'd been scared for months already, scared of wanting too much, scared of reading signals wrong, scared of ruining what we had by asking for more. At least now we could be scared together, honestly, without the exhausting performance of pretending we felt less than we did." Carter leaned forward then, slowly and deliberately, closing the space between us with the same careful intention he'd shown that first night when he'd whispered his warning. But this time, there were no words to contradict the action, no denials to cushion the impact of what was about to happen. This time, when he leaned in, I leaned in too. The kiss was nothing like I'd imagined it would be. For months, I'd constructed elaborate fantasies of how it might happen, desperate and passionate, born from some dramatic moment of revelation or heated argument that dissolved into recognition. I'd pictured something that would match the intensity of everything we'd been holding back, something that would feel like a dam bursting or lightning finally striking ground. Instead, it was gentle, tentative, almost reverent. When our lips met, it felt less like an explosion and more like coming home. Carter's mouth was warm and soft, and tasted faintly of the coffee we'd shared after dinner. The contact was brief at first, barely more than a brush of skin against skin, as if we were both testing whether this was really happening or if we might still wake up to discover we'd imagined it all. Then he kissed me again, deeper this time, and I felt 2 years of careful restraint dissolve in the space of a heartbeat. His hand found the side of my face, fingers threading through my hair with a tenderness that made my chest ache. This wasn't the desperate claim I'd imagined, but something softer and more profound, acknowledgement rather than conquest, recognition rather than possession. When we finally broke apart, we stayed close enough that I could feel his breath against my lips, could see the way his pupils had dilated in the dim light from my laptop screen. His forehead rested against mine, and for a long moment we just breathed the same air, processing what had just shifted between us. I expected him to say something, to analyze what had happened, to worry aloud about what it meant, to retreat behind the careful walls he'd been building and dismantling for weeks. Instead, he kissed me again, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. This was the dam breaking, the lightning strike, everything we'd been denying ourselves finally allowed to exist in the space between us. The weeks that followed rearranged my understanding of intimacy entirely. We didn't rush into anything dramatic or life-altering. We didn't have tearful conversations about labels or futures or what this meant for who we were. Instead, we settled into something that felt as natural as breathing, as if we'd simply stopped pretending we were something we'd never actually been. Carter still came over most evenings, but now, when he stretched out on my couch, he'd pull me down beside him without ceremony. His touch, which had been careful and loaded for so long, became easy again. Hands in my hair while we watched movies, fingers intertwined while we talked, the casual intimacy of bodies that had stopped maintaining artificial distance. My apartment looked the same, negatives still hanging like curtains between the windows, Polaroids still taped to every available surface, but it felt different, charged with possibility rather than longing, full of presence rather than absence. Carter's jacket would end up draped over my desk chair more often than not, his textbooks scattered among my photography equipment, small signs of a life being shared rather than simply visited. The photographs I took during those weeks were different too, though I didn't realize it at first. My professor commented on a series I'd submitted, noting something about the quality of light I was capturing, the way subjects seemed more relaxed and natural in front of my lens. It wasn't until later that I understood what had changed. I was no longer trying to capture connection from the outside, no longer documenting intimacy as an observer. I was living it. Carter never talked about what our relationship meant for his understanding of himself, and I never pushed him to. Some revelations require silence to take root, and I'd learned that the most profound transformations often happen in the spaces between words. What mattered wasn't how he labeled what we had, but how he moved through it, with increasing ease, with growing confidence, with the kind of peace that comes from finally stopping a fight you've been having with yourself. Sometimes I would photograph him when he wasn't looking, the way I'd wanted to do for 2 years, but never dared. Him reading on my couch, afternoon light falling across his face. His hands as he helped me organize contact sheets. The particular way he smiled when he caught me watching him, half amused and half something deeper that had no name. Those images joined the collection on my walls, but they felt different from everything else I'd captured. They weren't evidence of moments that had passed, but reminders of a present that continued to unfold, documentation of a life being lived rather than observed. One evening, about a month after that first kiss, Carter was helping me hang new prints when he paused in front of a photograph I'd taken of him the week before. He was studying it with the intensity he usually reserved for his anatomy textbooks, head tilted slightly as if trying to understand something about the image that went beyond simple recognition. "You make me look different," he said finally, without turning around. "Different how?" I asked, though I thought I knew what he meant. He was quiet for so long, I thought he might not answer. Then, still looking at the photograph, he said like someone who knows what he wants. The words settled into the space between us, carrying weight I felt in my chest. Because that was exactly what had changed, not just in how I photographed him, but in how he moved through the world when we were together. The careful performance of confidence had been replaced by something more genuine, more grounded. The questions he'd been asking himself had found answers, or at least had stopped feeling like questions that needed immediate resolution. The phrase "we shouldn't do this" had disappeared from our vocabulary entirely. In its place was something simpler and more honest, the recognition that some connections are stronger than the reasons we invent to avoid them, that some forms of love are worth the risk of becoming someone new. The story could end there with that recognition. But the truth is, it doesn't end at all. It simply continues, night after night, in the blue glow of my laptop screen, in the space between us on a couch that no longer feels like a place where we maintain careful distances. Sometimes Carter still leans in, the way he did that first night when everything changed. But now, when he does, there are no warnings whispered in the dark, no contradictions between words and actions, no space held open for retreat. Now, when he leans in, I lean in too, and we meet somewhere in the middle of a space we've learned to share without fear.